The morning I found a fully constructed floating restaurant anchored in the center of my private lake, I did not call a lawyer. I did not call the police. I walked back inside my house, made a cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started making a single phone call that would unravel everything Cheryl Dawson had spent 8 months building in approximately 48 hours. But let me take you back to where this started. Because the restaurant was not the beginning. It was just the moment everything became irreversible. My name is Colonel James Whitfield, retired. 31 years with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I know water. I know land. I know exactly what happens when someone builds something on a body of water they do not own. And I know precisely which phone numbers to call when that happens. I had moved to Harborview Estates 4 years earlier after my wife Margaret and I decided we wanted someone somewhere quiet for her recovery. Margaret had been battling a progressive autoimmune condition for 3 years, the kind that steals function slowly, then quickly, then without mercy. She needed peace. She needed clean air. She needed the sound of water, which her doctors had told us had measurable therapeutic effects on her nervous system. The lake behind our property, Lake Whitfield, named in the original deed for the family who had owned the land since 1987, was not a community amenity. It was not an HOA asset. It was private property, deeded entirely to us, with a surveyed boundary line that ran 6 feet beyond the eastern shore. Cheryl Dawson, HOA president of Harborview Estates, had never once acknowledged that boundary line in the 3 years she had been president. It started with a proposal. 8 months before the floating restaurant appeared, Cheryl had presented what she called the Harborview Waterfront Enhancement Initiative at the annual HOA meeting. Colorful brochures, architectural renderings, a catered presentation with sparkling water, and cheese plates that she had charged to the community maintenance fund. The centerpiece of her initiative was a floating dining pavilion. She called it that, a dining pavilion, never a restaurant, to be anchored on what she described as the community lake. I had stood up at that meeting and stated clearly, with a copy of the original deed in my hand, that the lake was not a community lake. It was private property. It appeared on no HOA plot. It was not referenced in any HOA governing documents. It belonged to Margaret and me entirely and had since the day we purchased the property. Cheryl had smiled the way she always smiled, warm on the surface and made of something which much colder underneath, and said, "Colonel Whitfield, the community has always considered the lake a shared natural resource. I think we can find a way to move forward together." "There is nothing to move forward on," I said. "The lake is not yours to develop." The meeting had moved on. I had assumed that was the end of it. It was not. Over the following months I noticed activity on the eastern shore, the shore that technically sat just outside our boundary line, on a thin strip of HOA maintained green space. Deliveries, construction equipment, workers arriving before sunrise and leaving after dark. I sent 3 formal written notices to Cheryl and the HOA board stating that any structure extending over or anchored in the lake would constitute trespassing on private property and would be addressed accordingly. The HOA board sent back a 2 paragraph letter, each time informing me that the project had been approved by a majority board vote and that the dining pavilion would enhance property values for all residents. I kept every letter. I kept every email. I kept every delivery receipt I could photograph from my property line. I had learned in 31 years of military engineering that documentation was the foundation of every successful operation. Then on a Thursday morning in October, I walked out onto my back porch with my coffee and saw it, a floating restaurant, fully constructed, white fabric canopy, string lights already installed, tables and chairs visible through the open sides, a small dock extending from the eastern shore with a rope line tying the entire structure to an anchor point. That was. I walked down to confirm this myself with a measuring tape. 14 feet inside the surveyed boundary of my private lake. I stood there for a moment. Then I went inside and called Patricia Gwen. Patricia was not just a property attorney. She was the former chief counsel for the state's Department of Natural Resources, a woman who had spent 20 years litigating water rights cases and had never once lost a private property claim involving a body of water. She was also Margaret's college roommate, which meant she answered my call on the second ring and had a full briefing within 20 minutes. They anchored inside your boundary, she asked. 14 feet, I said. A pause. James, they opened a commercial food service operation on private property without owner consent, without a commercial waterway permit, without a health department license for waterborne food service, and without flood zone construction authorization. Another pause. How long until their soft opening? Saturday, I said. 48 hours. Don't touch anything, she said. Don't move anything. Don't drain anything yet. Give me until tomorrow morning. Patricia moved fast. By Friday afternoon she had filed an emergency injunction with the county court citing unlawful commercial encroachment on private property. She had contacted the State Department of Natural Resources, which confirmed that no waterway construction permit had been issued for Harbor View Estates. She had contacted the County Health Department, which confirmed that no commercial food service license existed for any floating structure at the address. She had contacted the Army Corps of Engineers, for my former employer, which confirmed that the anchor placement violated federal navigable water regulations. Four separate violations, four separate authorities, all filed within 18 hours. But here is what changed everything. Margaret had been having a difficult week. The noise from the construction, the boats motoring past our shore, the generators running overnight. Her neurologist had called me Thursday evening to say that her inflammation markers had elevated and that the disruption to her environment was a measurable medical concern. He put that in writing. Patricia added it to the injunction as a supplemental medical hardship filing. The county court judge who reviewed the emergency injunction had a name I recognized the moment Patricia texted it to me. Judge Harold Whitfield, my cousin. I want to be absolutely clear. I did not call Harold. I did not contact him. I did not know the case had been assigned to his docket until Patricia told me. But I will tell you that Harold Whitfield had grown up fishing on Lake Whitfield as a boy, that his name was on that lake as much as mine was, and that when he reviewed the filing at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening and saw the address and the lake name and the four regulatory violations and the medical hardship supplement, he signed the injunction in 20 minutes. The injunction required immediate cessation of all activity on the structure and authorized the property owner to take reasonable steps to restore the original condition of the private waterway. Reasonable steps. I called Dennis Hargrove at 7:30 Friday evening. Dennis was a retired Army engineer I had served with for 12 years, a man who knew heavy equipment the way other men know their own handwriting. I explained the situation. He showed up Saturday morning at 6 a.m. with a pump truck, two assistants, and the specific, quiet competence of someone who had redirected rivers in three different countries. We did not drain the lake completely. I want to be clear about that. We lowered the water level by 4 feet, precisely enough to ground the floating restaurant on the lake bed, rendering it immovable and inoperable, while leaving the lake itself intact and the fish undisturbed. The soft opening was scheduled for noon. At 11:58 a.m., Cheryl Dawson arrived at the Eastern Shore dock in a white dress with the ribbon-cutting scissors and approximately 30 HOA residents behind her, several of whom were carrying wine glasses in anticipation. The restaurant was sitting on the mud, string lights still on, tables still set, wide canopy flapping gently in the October breeze. Sitting on the mud. Cheryl stood at the end of the dock and stared at it for a very long time without speaking. I was watching from my back porch. I had my coffee. Margaret was beside me in her chair, wrapped in a blanket, and when the restaurant settled fully into the lake bed with a sound that carried clearly across the water, she laughed, genuinely, fully, the way she had not laughed in months. She reached over and took my hand. The HOA received formal citations from four separate regulatory bodies within the following week. The total remediation cost, removal of the structure, restoration of the shoreline, permit violation fines, was assessed at $62,000, charged entirely to the HOA operating fund. Cheryl Dawson resigned as HOA president the following Tuesday. The resignation letter was 3 sentences long and cited a desire to pursue other interests. The Harborview Estates HOA governing documents were amended 2 weeks later to include an explicit acknowledgement that Lake Whitfield was private property and that no HOA development proposal or initiative could reference, utilize, or encroach upon it in any capacity. Margaret's inflammation markers returned to baseline within 10 days of the noise stopping. The lake is quiet again. On good mornings she sits on the back porch and watches the light move across the water, and sometimes I sit beside her and we don't say anything at all, because there is nothing that needs to be said. The restaurant is gone, the lake remains. And somewhere in a county court filing archives there is an emergency injunction signed by Judge Harold Whitfield on a Friday evening that will remain part of the public record of Harborview Estates for as long as the neighborhood exists. Some things are worth documenting, every single one of them. If this story satisfied something in you, if you believe that private property and the people who depend on it deserve to be protected, subscribe. The next story is already waiting.